Reckoner archivist Corin Aumbre had kept the first empty box for most of a lifetime without ever quite letting himself understand why, and on the morning this story begins he finally laid it down beside the others, and read across them, left to right, and understood the whole of it in the time it takes to read one sentence, because that is what they were. He had been a junior clerk when the first one came. He remembered it the way you remember the small moment that turns out, decades on, to have been the largest of your life, an ordinary afternoon, an ordinary filing, a reckoning report from a mining moon called Cold Harbor, filed by a reckoner named Marinon whose name everyone in the guild knew, 206 worlds and never wrong. And in the box at the bottom of the form, the box that in 90,000 years of records had never once been empty, the box for the fold signal, the moment a people breaks, nothing. Empty. And beside it, in the reckoner's own hand, in a space where no note had ever been written, no fold signal was observed, because none exists in this species. He had kept a copy that same afternoon, before he understood why, and he never did stop keeping copies, and that is the whole of what this story is about before it is about anything else. There were 10 of them, in the end, laid out on the long table of the archive on the morning this story begins, and he had spent the better part of a life becoming the kind of man who would be sitting there when the 10th one arrived. This is the story of the morning the Accord could no longer not know, and of what a civilization does when it is finally, provably, undeniably shown the one truth it cannot survive. It is the last of the 10 stories I have told you, and it is the one they were always leading to, and I will tell you now, at the start, so you can watch for it. Knowing was never the problem. That is the thing this whole season has been walking toward. The Accord found out. It found out completely, in 10 hands, from 10 corners of the frontier, in the coldest and most incontrovertible language it owned. And it did not save anyone, because the problem was never that the Accord did not know. The problem was what a frightened and reasonable civilization does with a truth it cannot bear, which is the same thing, it turns out, that a marshal did above Salt Lick, and a founder will do at Anvil, and a good person does in every room where the wisest and kindest voice decides that everyone else cannot handle the truth. Watch. Here is the Accord, being shown. Here is what being shown was worth. Aumbre could tell you, if you asked him on the wrong evening, the exact hour he understood he had become a man who could not stop. It was not the afternoon the Cold Harbor report came in. That afternoon he had only felt the cold, the small private cold of a blank space where a form had never once had a blank space, and he had done the thing a junior clerk does with a feeling like that, which is nothing, because a junior clerk's feelings are not part of the record. He had filed it. He had kept his copy in a drawer he told himself was simply a clerk's habit of thoroughness, the kind every good archivist develops and none of them can quite explain. It was 2 years later, filing a routine transfer of Salvage Guild correspondence that had nothing to do with Cold Harbor at all, that he found 4 words written in a foreman's hand in the margin of a fee slip from a port called Marrow's Rest, forwarded up through channels that existed only because a tired clerk somewhere had thought it odd enough to pass along. They carried them all, and Aumbre read it, and felt the same cold, exactly the same cold, in a document that had nothing to do with a reckoner or a tally or a mining moon at all, and understood, standing at his own desk with the ordinary business of the afternoon still waiting for him, that the cold was not going to be explained by Cold Harbor alone. Something was moving under the record. He did not have a name for it. He kept the fee slip anyway, and told himself, for the second time, that he was only being thorough. That was the hour, if you pressed him for one. Not the first cold, but the second, because the first could be dismissed as a strange afternoon and the second could not, and a lesser archivist would have stopped there, filed the coincidence under coincidence, and gone home to a life with room in it for other things. Aumbre did not stop. He rose in the guild the way careful, exact, unremarkable people rise in institutions that value carefulness and exactness and are not always looking closely at what is unremarkable about them, and at every rung of that rise he kept his eyes open for the cold, and the cold kept finding him, because the frontier kept sending it up, one report at a time, to an archive that had learned, without anyone deciding it should, to trust Corona Umbre with the things it did not know what to do with. A marshal's after-action report reached him next, years on, carried up the chain not by a runner but by the marshal's own second, because some reports a man carries himself or does not really mean, and it sat in the deep collection under a classification that meant flinched at until a request crossed Ombre's desk from a place with the plain name Ferrymore, and he read a blank folding line and a hard sentence written under it in an old campaigner's hand, the enemy did not fold, and copied it. Before it could be quietly lost the way flinched at things are so often quietly lost. A xenologist's sealed monograph came to him differently, and later, the way the truest things in that archive always seem to arrive, not delivered, but found, a gap in a catalogue with a title and a seal and nothing behind it, on the non-propagation of grief in the Terran species. And Umbre had spent the better part of a season simply proving to a suspicious senior reader that his interest in an old suppressed paper was scholarly and not political, before he was permitted to read, in a hand gone shaky near the end of it, the plainest and most dangerous sentence in the Guild's whole deep collection. A tactician's hazard note reached him the ordinary way, through the halls the reckoner's answer to, filed for the widest distribution its author's rank allowed and read, in the years since, by almost no one, because a hazard classified that plainly frightens the very people meant to read it into finding reasons not to. A Senate's transcript he did not have to go looking for at all. It was simply the record, kept the way the Accord kept everything, in a hall he could walk into on any ordinary morning, and it took him a long time to make himself do it, because he already suspected, long before he read a page of it, what a chamber does with a fear it cannot resolve. There were others. A Sibiran audit testimony, filed by a node the humans at some forgotten relay station had nicknamed Low, transcribed a second time in a human hand so that a copy would survive if the first one did not, and both copies, in the end, found their way to Ombre's drawer, because he had learned by then to ask for copies of anything that used the word unreachable in a field built to hold the word felt. An administrator's resignation came to him filed, absurdly, as a personnel matter, the kind of document that is meant to be read once and shelved forever, and Umbre read it twice, and could not have told you, if you had asked him that evening, what exactly it was about a woman's confession that a farm town could not be folded that made his hands, for the first time in a long career of steady hands, go still on the desk. And last, worst, heaviest, a fleet marshal's casualty ledger reached him the way such things reach an archive in the end, carried by someone who could no longer bear to be the only one holding it, and Umbre opened it alone, at night, in the deep collection, and read a dead column climbed past any figure in the history of Accord War standing beside a fold index that had never once, in the whole grinding length of the account, moved off zero. He never married. He never quite let himself notice that he had not. There was, in the long private accounting he kept and never showed anyone, a kind of grim comedy in it that he alone was positioned to see, that the very thing the reports were teaching him, the thing that a Velthani archivist's whole science had no word for, was a truth he was living out in miniature every night he sat alone with a document no one else in the guild could be trusted to understand. He carried what he carried, in his own private drawer, in his own private dark, and it never once occurred to him, in all those years, to set any of it down or to hand it to someone else to carry, because that was not a thing he knew how to do, any more than a foreman on Cold Harbor had known how to stop climbing an incline she had already decided was hers to hold. He would have told you, if you had pressed him, that he was only being thorough. He would have been telling the truth, and it would have been the smallest part of the truth, and by the time he understood that, he had been keeping the sentence for the better part of a lifetime, one silent word at a time, waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for it to be whole. On the morning this story begins, an old man now, reckoner archivist Corona took them all out of the sealed drawer where he had kept them across the whole of a long career, and laid them in a row across the long table of the archive, and looked, for the first time, at what he had. He set down the Cold Harbor report first, because it had been first, and because a reader needs a place to begin. A reckoner's empty box, in a hand 200 years disciplined into never once being wrong, saying the thing that had started all of it, no fold signal was observed, because none exists in this species. He set the corrible's fee slip beside it, for words in a foreman's hand carried up through a network the powerful had never thought to notice. They carried them all, and he remembered, laying it down, the cold he had felt at his own desk decades before, undimmed. He set Ferrymore's after-action report third, the folding line left honestly blank and the hard sentence under it, the enemy did not fold, and beside it Ledgerton's sealed monograph, the plainest and most dangerous prose in the Guild's deep collection, the one that had cost a scholar the whole shining edifice of a career and a friend the comfort of ever knowing what his own letters had proved. He set the Straits Hazard note fifth, our certainty can be used against us, a tactician's elegant gift turned back on him and filed anyway, because a hazard unflagged is not caution, it is only a secret with better manners. He set the quorum's clean transcript sixth, every word kept, the record of an afternoon on which a great many decent people had, by reasonable and civilized steps, built the machine that would not need any of them to feel like its architect. He set the sounder's testimony seventh, in a Cibran's careful field and a human hand's careful copy both, subject mind unreachable, not closed, not empty. He set Winnow's resignation eighth, filed as a confession because that was what it was, there is no fold in these people. And he set Saltlick's ledger last of the nine, the dead column risen past any figure the Accord's whole history of war had ever produced and the fold index beside it flat, unmoved, 0 from the first hour to the last. 9 reports. 9 hands that had never met, from 9 corners of a frontier none of them had known the others were watching, each one certain, when they wrote, that they were filing an anomaly, a single strange thing, explainable, forgivable, the kind of exception that a great institution absorbs without ever having to change its shape. That was how the Guild had survived the accumulating file for as long as it had, by never once reading it together. Each report, taken alone, was a puzzle for a specialist to shelve. It was only when you laid them side by side, all 9, the empty places aligned, that they stopped being 9 puzzles and became one sentence, and the sentence was not a puzzle at all. It was a law. It was the plainest law Corona had ever read, written 9 times in 9 hands by 9 people who would never meet each other, each of whom had gone to the human frontier certain of the Accord's whole science and come home having watched that science fail in the same place, in the same way, for the same reason. And the 10th was the one he was about to write himself, because he understood, laying the 9 in a row and reading across their empty places, that he was looking at the whole of a thing at last, and that the reading of it made him the 10th witness, and that the Guild was going to have to be told. He wrote it out that morning, the 10th document, the archivist's synthesis, in the plain style of a man who has spent his life making scattered things speak. In simple terms, he wrote, because he had learned from the reports themselves that the truest things want the plainest words, every science of the Accord rests on a single assumption, that a people is one thing, joined, that what moves through one member moves through all, so that a people can be reckoned, and folded, and defeated as a body. In these 9 reports, from 9 unconnected sources, that assumption fails identically. It fails because in this one species, grief, and with it despair, surrender, the whole shared machinery of the fold, does not propagate. Each human is separate, island, unpooled. There is no channel between them for a breaking to travel. And so there is no threshold at which they yield as one, because there is no one of them to yield. They can be reckoned individually and folded never. They can be killed, to the last, as the Saltlick ledger proves past any denying, and never at any point be made to stop. The yield does not apply to them. It has never applied to them. 200 years of frontier war have been, without our knowing it, a 200-year experiment that has returned the same result every time, and the result is this: we cannot fold humanity, and we never could, and every report that says otherwise is a clerk writing the lie because the form has no field for the truth. He set down the stylus. He looked at the 10 documents in their row, the 9 he had kept across a lifetime and the 10th he had just made, and Coronel, who had carried the first empty box since he was a young man for reasons he could never fully name, understood at last why he had carried it. He had been keeping the sentence until it was whole. And now it was whole, and it was the most dangerous sentence in the galaxy, and there was only one thing an archivist does with a true thing, however dangerous, which is to bring it into the light and let those who govern decide, and Aumbre, who had spent a lifetime believing that the record, read completely, must matter, went to find the one person who could tell him what it looked like to be right and still lose, certain, the way Nadia Cole had once been certain and Thessery Vaughn had once been certain, that being shown would be enough. He had one friend on the human side by then, and her name was Nadia Cole, and she was the only person in the galaxy he could show the whole file to before he brought it to power, because she was the only one who had already lost the same fight and could tell him what losing it looked like. They had come to know each other in the years after the quorum, the archivist and the ambassador, a quiet back-channel correspondence begun, on his side, almost by accident, a formal request for a point of translation in the transcript, answered more fully and more honestly than the request had asked for, and continued, letter by careful letter, because each of them had recognized in the other the rare thing a lonely truth-teller recognizes in another lonely truth-teller, which is simply someone who will not pretend not to see what they have both already seen. She had warned her people, after the quorum, and been half-believed, and had spent the years since watching the machine she foresaw grind slowly toward its first example, carrying that knowledge the way Aumbre carried his, alone, in her own private dark, because there was no one on either side of the gap who could carry it with her. When Aumbre wrote to her that he had it now, all of it, the whole file whole, and that he was going to bring it to the guild, Nadia Cole did not write back with a question. She came, on the next ship the back channel could arrange, because she wanted to see it, the true record of her people, laid out at last by someone who believed it. She read across the 10 boxes the way Aumbre had, slowly, left to right, and she wept, a little, which she had not expected to, because it was one thing to live the truth of her people and another to see it written down in 10 alien hands, each one the record of a moment when some human, somewhere, had refused to be folded and some accord functionary had been unable to look away from the refusal. She read Marinon's blank field and Voss's honest sentence and Fenno's ruined margin notes and Sar's hazard classified past almost anyone's reading and the clean transcript that had cost her the room she had gone to plead in, and when she reached the ledger from Salt Lake, the last of the 9, she stopped a long moment before she could make herself finish it, because she had known people who had gone to Salt Lake, or people who had known them, the way every human eventually does on a frontier. Small enough that the war touches everyone at one remove or less. Then she did the thing that Aumbre most needed and least expected, which was to give the file back its people. "You've made it a law," she said. "And it is a law, and you're right, and I need you to hear what I'm about to say as gratitude, because it is. But look what a law does. Look what you've done, the same thing the quorum did, the same thing Alt did, you've taken all of them and made them into a sentence. And I understand why. The sentence is true and it has to be said. But before you carry it into that room, let me give them back, just to you, just once, because you kept them for a lifetime and you should know whose boxes you've been carrying." And she went down the row, and named them. "This one," she said, at the first, "is a foreman named Wren Halloway, who ran the last live gallery on a dying moon and told a reckoner there wasn't a number, because there wasn't. She held a heading with a bad roof and a green boy named Dell at her shoulder, and she buried a husband alone, the 6th day, and never once let it show on her face, because a foreman's face is a roof too, and the crew reads it the same way. She brought her count up out of the dark at the end of every shift, the way you always bring it up, and she is not in any history of how your accord fell, and she would tell you, if you asked her, that she only ran her shift and got her daughter home. That was the whole of it. That was the thing your empire could not survive. She moved to the second box, and her hand rested on it a moment before she spoke, the way you touch a thing that is heavier than its size. This one is a captain, Silas Boone, who would not cut his dead loose to lighten a tow. 26 of his people died in a sheer 6 days from anywhere, and he carried them to the coldest part of his ship and learned each one over again by the weight of them, and when a Kedmer shipwright laid 2 true numbers in front of him, the numbers that said his 8 living would die if his 26 dead came with them, he told her the truth was uglier than her numbers, and she believed him, and she found a third number nobody in her trade had ever bothered to look for, because he would not let her stop looking. He stood at the top of a ramp in a gray port and said every name along with the woman who read them, half a beat behind, so that each one of his crew came home named twice. He is the reason a shipwright wrote 4 words in the margin of a fee slip that reached you, Corin, at your own desk, before you understood what you were becoming. This one is a sergeant, Della Cray, who held a relay post that mattered to no one and kept a surrender door open all night without ever once deciding for anyone whether to walk through it. She said the roll every hour, position to position, long after there was hardly anyone left to answer it, because a name said aloud is a person still held. A marshal offered her people mercy 6 times, honestly, and kept the door open himself past any sense in it, and every time she told her own the truth, that the door was real, that they could go, that she would think no less of any soul who walked through it, and not one of them did, not because they were brave, but because there was no one decision in 31 people, there were 31 decisions, and they never once came due at the same hour. She died on the mast at dawn with an 18-year-old farm boy beside her who told her he couldn't leave her up there saying names alone, and she told him that was the only kind of reason there was. This one is a schoolteacher, Tomas Reed, who wrote a foreigner letters for a year and never knew he was being studied, and who told his friend, when the fever came, about a widower named Halloran who lost his wife of 40 years and still sets 2 cups at the breakfast table every morning, pours them both, drinks his, washes them both, and will go on doing it until the day he sets only one. Tomas never learned that his ordinary letters proved the most dangerous truth in the galaxy, or that the scholar he wrote to buried a monograph with his town's dead in it to keep Ledgerton safe a while longer. He thought he was writing to a lonely foreigner who liked hearing about a well committee and a bad poem. He was right about that, as far as it went. He never knew how far it went, and that not knowing was the last mercy anyone was able to give him. This is a smuggler, SCI-FI, who had spent 20 years making a philosophy out of running from every fight in her life, and who spent 16 ships and every crew on them to close a door on 30 heavy hulls so that 4,000 people she would never meet could cross a strait called the Straits and live. She built the trap herself, in a suit, in the cold, hand to hand with the miners who wired it, because she had decided that if she was going to spend people she loved she would not do it from somewhere safe. She survived it, which she called the one cruelty she had not planned for, and she carries 16 ships worth of names the rest of her life, and she would tell you she was not a hero, and she would be lying only about the word. This one is a relay technician, June Alder, who spent a lonely posting talking to a creature that had never in its whole existence been unable to feel a mind, and taught it, patiently, the way every human has always had to teach every other human, how to be known by someone who cannot feel you. She narrated her small days to it, the weather, the bad tea, her sister 3 systems off, until a being that could sense 400 billion of its own kind at once learned to love one voice it could never touch. It filed the truth about her because she told it to, tell them true, and copied the testimony herself, in her own hand, in case the other copy got lost. It did not get lost. Hers survived anyway, because the islands keep their true things twice. This is a family called Harrow, a widower named Eli and his children, who set a place at the table, every single night, for the administrator sent to fold their town from the inside. Not as surrender, and not as forgiveness. Because that was how the house worked, and Eli Harrow had decided the occupation would not be the thing that changed how his house worked, even if it cost him everything to hold that line at his own table. The woman he fed came, in the end, to believe she could not fold a town that was never one will to break, and when she had the lie in her hand, the report that would have said the town was folded when it was not, she set it down, and Eli Harrow washed her plate and put it back in the rack with his own family's, one last time, as if she had never been anything but a person under his roof. And this last one, her voice caught, at the 9th box, at the climbing dead and the flat zero beside it, this last one is a survivor named Rue Calder, and a world, and every child in it, who died in the dark telling each other the true story, which is harder than the other one, and better. She had been a child once herself, spared as a girl in a shelter when a marshal's ships thinned and went, and she carried that mercy her whole life as a debt, and she was still carrying it the day the same marshal came back to prove the mercy had been a mistake. She told the children of her town, at the end, that they were not brave, they were only themselves, and that being themselves was the one thing no ship in the sky could reach in and switch off. Every one of them is in the dead column of that ledger. Not one of them is in the fold index. It never moved. Not once. Not by the smallest fraction, from the first hour to the last. She was quiet a moment, her hand still on the 9th box, and then she looked up at Aumbre and gave him the last piece, the one he had not thought to ask for. "You'll notice I haven't given you back the 6th, she said. "The quorum's transcript. That one doesn't need it. That one was always mine. I was in that room, Corin. You already have my name. You've had it since the day you wrote to me about a point of translation, and I told you more than you asked, because I had already decided, sitting in that chamber, that if anyone ever laid this file out whole, I wanted at least one box in the row that came with its person already attached, so that whoever read it would know that being named and being counted are not the same mercy, and that the second one is not enough. These aren't empty boxes, Corin. That's the thing your guild is never going to understand, even shown. Every one of these boxes is empty because a person filled their whole life instead. The box is empty because they didn't fold. It's the most full thing in your archive. It only looks empty because the Accord only ever learned to read one kind of writing. He tried, before she left the archive that night, to give her something back, because it seemed to him the one decent thing left to do, and he found he did not have much to offer that was truly his to give. He was not a man who kept people the way she kept them, in stories, in names spoken aloud until the speaking made them real again for a moment. He kept forms. He kept the shape of a thing rather than its weight, and he told her so, plainly, the way the letters between them had always been plain, and Nadia only shook her head at that and told him he was wrong about himself, that a man who could not stop collecting 9 strangers' worst hours for a lifetime, at the cost of every ordinary comfort a life is supposed to hold, had been keeping their weight the whole time and simply never had a word for it, because Velthani built for 100,000 years on the certainty that grief moves between minds had never had to invent a word for carrying one alone. It was, she said, the first thing about him she had ever envied and pitied in the same breath, and she did not explain further, and he did not ask her to, because some part of him had already understood it, sitting with the older box in the night still ahead of him that neither of them yet knew were coming. Corin Aumbre looked at the row of documents that he had thought of, for a lifetime, as boxes, and saw them for a moment as Nadia saw them, as people, and understood that he was about to carry them into a room that would only ever be able to see the law, and never the lives, and that this was the whole tragedy, and that he was going to do it anyway, because the law was true and the room had to be shown, even knowing. He knew it now, watching her weep over the names, that being shown was not going to be enough. He brought it to the guild, and the guild was shown, completely, and it did exactly what Aumbre had spent a lifetime refusing to believe it would do, which was to understand entirely, and bury it entirely, in the same motion, with clean hands. They did not dispute the finding. That was the unbearable thing, the same unbearable thing a xenological reader had faced over a monograph about teacups and Nadia Cole had faced in a chamber that hurt her and voted past her anyway. The elders of the guild read the 9 boxes and read Aubry's synthesis and did not argue with a word of it, because it could not be argued with, because 9 unconnected hands do not lie the same lie by accident. They sat in the long room where the deepest record of the accord was kept, readers and reckoners both, some of them old enough to remember when the doctrine of the yield had still felt like a discovery and not a law of nature, and they passed the 10 documents hand to hand down the table in a silence Aumbre had not expected and found, when it came, more frightening than any argument would have been. One elder, reading the Ferrymore report, set it down and did not pick up the next one for a long moment, and Aumbre watched her hands, folded on the table, and understood that she was doing the arithmetic in private before she would allow herself to do it aloud. Another, younger, read Fenno's ruined margins and asked, quietly, whether the scholar who wrote them was still living, and was told he was not, and seemed to need to know that before he could go on to the next report, as if the dead deserved to be asked after before their proof was used. They understood it fully. That every science their civilization was built on had a hole in it exactly the shape of a species. That the whole moral architecture of the fold, the thing that let the accord call itself a civilization and not a butcher, had rested for 100,000 years on a luck it had just run out of, the luck that every enemy it ever met could be folded, so that its mercy and its victory had always pointed the same direction and it had never once had to choose between them. Nobody in that room needed the finding explained to them twice. That was the thing Aumbre had spent his whole life believing would matter, and watching them understand it so completely, so instantly, so without argument, he learned in the space of a single afternoon that understanding was never going to be the mercy he had thought it was. And then, understanding it, they did the reasonable thing, the careful thing, the thing a frightened institution does with a truth it cannot survive, which was to decide that the truth could not be allowed to be true in public. The finding was sealed. Aumbre watched it happen the way you watch a thing you have foreseen and still cannot quite believe. His synthesis, the 10 boxes, the whole file, classified, sealed, entered into the deep collection where the guild kept the things it could not afford to know it knew, beside a xenologist's monograph that had gone the same way a lifetime before, and beside, though none of them said so aloud, the whole architecture of committees and careful clauses that a Senate had built for exactly this moment years earlier. In an afternoon of reasonable motions no one in that room had voted for as an atrocity, and every one of which had made this one possible. The elders did not destroy the file. They could not. The guild could no more destroy the best documented finding in its history than it could act on it in the open. Sealed. And then, in the same sitting, with the same reasonable faces, they took the next honest step, and it was not a new step at all, only the one a chamber had already prepared years before and left waiting, patient and procedural, for exactly this kind of finding to arrive on its desk, if humanity could not be folded, and the fact could not be made public without unmaking the accord's whole order. Then the frontier had to be managed some other way, had to be shown, by an example, that resistance had a cost, even resistance that could not technically be folded. One of the younger readers tried, once, to slow it, in the same voice a moderate always tries to slow it, by asking the room to notice how much weight was traveling across a joint no one had actually argued for. The finding says these people cannot be folded, she said. It does not say what must be done about that. I would ask the table to notice how quickly we have moved from cannot be folded to must be made an example of, and I would ask whether that second step has been earned by anything in these 10 documents, or only by our own fear of what they mean. It was, Aumbre thought, listening, almost exactly the objection Perrine Dale had once made in a different chamber and lost, and it fared no better here, because no one needed to win the argument against her. The room only needed its own fear to cross the gap on its own, and it did, the way it always did, quietly, while the objection was still being politely acknowledged. Nobody answered her directly. The table simply moved past her, the way water moves past a stone too small to turn it, and she sat with that, and said nothing further, and Aumbre watched her fold her own hands the way the elder reading Ferrymore's report had folded hers, doing the arithmetic in private because there was no longer anywhere public left to do it. An old reader, the most senior in the room, was the one who said it plainest, and he said it the way Alt had once said it in a different chamber, without cruelty, with something that might even have been grief in his voice. "We are not deciding to destroy them," he said. "I want that understood, because it matters to me, and I think it should matter to all of us, that no one in this room is proposing what the word would make it sound like we are proposing. We are deciding that a species which cannot be measured cannot be governed by measurement, and that a civilization which cannot govern what it cannot measure must, eventually, make the ungovernable cost something, or it has no order left to offer anyone. I take no pleasure in the shape of that sentence. I have read the finding twice and I believe every word of it. And I believe, just as certainly, that this room cannot walk out of it having changed nothing. The word genocide was not said. It was never said. But the decision that would become, in time, a colony called Enville erased to make a point was taken in that room, that day, by reasonable people who had just been shown, in 10 hands, exactly why it would not work, who knew, provably, that you cannot make an example of a people who do not fold, because the example only proves again that they do not fold, and who chose to make the example anyway, because the truth was sealed, and the fear was not, and a frightened reasonable civilization would always, in the end, choose the arithmetic of the example over the unbearable arithmetic of the truth. Aumbre did not stop it. He had brought the file believing that being shown would be enough, and he had been wrong, the way Nadia had told him he would be wrong, the way she had once been wrong herself, and there was a moment in that long room when he understood that the only thing that might have stopped it was for him to do the unreasonable thing, to refuse the seal, to carry the file out and make it public and burn his own place in the guild to the ground, and Corin Aumbre, who had spent a lifetime being the keeper of the record and not its wielder, found, like Thessery Vaughan before him, that he could not become in one afternoon the opposite of everything he was. So he let them seal it. He was the 10th witness, and he had carried the truth for a lifetime and brought it into the light, and the light had looked at it and closed the drawer, and Aumbre went back to his archive an old man who had done the one thing his whole life had been for, and watched it change nothing, and understood that this had always been the ending, from the first empty box, that knowing was never going to be the thing that saved anyone, because the accord's sickness was never ignorance. It was the thing it did with what it knew. After the guild sealed the file, Corin Aumbre went back into the deep archive, the oldest part, where the records go back past the point where anyone still living can read the hands they are written in, and he did the thing an archivist does when he cannot change the present, which is to go looking in the past. He wanted to know if it had ever happened before. He did not expect it to have. 200 years of human frontier war was a long time to him, but it was nothing against the age of the archive, and he searched the deep record almost as a morning ritual, a way of sitting with the thing, not expecting to find anything at all. He went down through strata of storage that had not been opened in his working memory, past shelving systems 3 schemes out of date, past a whole silent gallery of forms the guild no longer even used, and he did it alone, at night, the way he had done everything that mattered in this account, because that had become, without his ever deciding it should, the only way he knew how to carry a thing. The search took him the better part of a season. He read reckoning forms from ages so old the species named on them no longer existed even as a memory, folds recorded in a hand style the guild's own historians could barely place, a whole graveyard of extinguished peoples each with a tidy time written in the box at the bottom of the form, because in 90,000 years the box had always gotten a time written in it. He was looking for another blank one. He told himself he did not expect to find it, and some part of him, the part that had spent a lifetime learning to trust the cold before he could name it, went on looking anyway, methodically, the way you keep turning a key in a lock you already suspect does not open. The deep stack was not built for comfort, and Aumbre did not make it comfortable. He worked by a single carried lamp because the old stacks had never been wired for anything better, and the cold down there was a different cold than the one he had carried in his chest for a lifetime, a plain physical cold that got into his hands and made the older bindings difficult to turn without tearing them, and he turned them anyway, patiently, the way he had always been patient, because an archivist who tears the thing he is trying to read has already failed at the one duty that matters. He catalogued as he went, out of habit more than need, noting which shelving scheme each stratum belonged to, watching the guild's own record of itself grow stranger and sparer the further back he went, until entire centuries were represented by a single surviving ledger and then, further back still, by nothing at all, by a gap in the shelving with a placeholder card in a hand so old it used letters the modern Velthani script had long since dropped. He had spent a career learning to read gaps. He had never before stood in one this large. He found one thing. One report, near the very bottom of the oldest stratum the archive still permitted anyone to enter. It was very old, older than anything else in the whole deep collection, the dating put it at 10,000 years, far back in the long stable middle of the accord, an age from which almost nothing survived and nothing at all survived about the human arm, which the record simply did not mention, as though the human worlds had been settled only in the last 2 centuries and there had been nothing out there before. And this report was a reckoning form, the same form, 90,000 years unchanged, and it had the same box at the bottom, the fold signal box, and the box was empty. And beside it, in a hand 10,000 years dead, a clerk had written a single word. Incomplete. That was all. Not no fold signal was observed because none exists in this species, the way Marinon had written it. Not the careful synthesis Aumbre had spent a lifetime building toward. Just the one word, incomplete, in a box that should have held a time, on a form 10,000 years old, from an age in which the Accord's own records insisted there had been no humans at all to reckon. Aumbre stood with it for a long time, in the cold of the deepest stack, the lamp he carried throwing a small circle of light around a document that had waited longer for a reader than the whole of his own species' recorded history. He did not understand it. He turned it over in every way an archivist knows to turn a document over, checked the dating twice against 3 separate methods, searched the surrounding shelves for anything filed beside it that might give the single word a context, and found nothing, because its meaning had been taken out of the record long before Aumbre was born, so thoroughly and so carefully that the only thing left was the shape of the whole, a reckoning of a species the record said did not yet exist, 10,000 years before it was supposed to exist, filed and then, in some way Aumbre could feel but not prove, unwritten from everything around it, leaving only this one form, this one empty box, this one word, standing in the archive like the last stone of a building whose plan no one alive had ever seen. He carried it back up out of the deep stack the way he had once carried the first empty box up out of a junior clerk's ordinary afternoon, and he sat with it in his own quarters for 3 nights before he did anything at all, because there was, this time, no guild left to bring it to. The finding was already sealed. The example was already chosen. Whatever this older box meant, it belonged to a story that had not yet been told, and would not be told by him, because he did not have it in him to tell, only to hold. He filed it, in the end, alone, in the sealed drawer with the rest, exactly where he had always kept the things he could not explain, and he never learned what it meant, and neither did anyone else, for a very long time. He only knew, turning the lamp down on it the third night, that whatever the older clerk had unwritten, 10,000 years before, had been unwritten by someone who understood the record at least as well as Corin Aumbre did, and had chosen, for reasons that were not his to know, to leave exactly one word standing where the whole of an explanation should have been. He kept faith with that clerk the only way he knew how, across 10,000 years he could not cross in any other fashion, which was to leave the word exactly as he had found it, and not pretend, for the comfort of a tidy ending, to understand a single thing more than it said. I told you at the start to watch for one thing, and now that you have seen all 10 boxes and the older one behind them, let me say it plainly, because it is the whole of what the season had to say. Knowing was never the problem. The Accord found out. It found out completely, provably, in 9 hands from 9 corners of the frontier, in the coldest language it owned, and a 10th hand made the finding whole, and it sealed the finding and chose the example anyway, because the sickness of the Accord, the sickness this whole season has been anatomizing one story at a time, was never ignorance. It was the good person who decides that a truth is unbearable, and chooses, at everyone else's expense, not to bear it. A reckoner who spared a moon rather than know. A marshal who killed a world rather than know. A senate that built a machine rather than act on what it already knew the machine would be used for. A guild that understood everything and buried everything with clean hands, in the same room, in the same afternoon, and called it responsible, because it was reasonable, and reasonable was the only word the Accord had left for the thing it was becoming. And the humans never knew any of it. That is the last thing, the thing Nadia Cole understood and the guild never would. The foreman and the captain and the sergeant and the schoolteacher and the smuggler and the technician and the family and the survivor, and every one of the numberless dead behind the 9 boxes, did not hold their galleries and carry their dead and set their tables and drive up their terrible ledgers as part of a grand resistance, because there was no grand resistance, there was no all of them, there was only each of them, alone, in their own kitchen and their own dark, doing the one small, unfoldable thing that was theirs to do. The Accord read those boxes as empty because it had only ever learned to read one kind of writing. Nadia Cole read them as the fullest things in the archive, and gave them their names back before Aumbre carried them into a room that would only ever see the law. They were both right. That was the whole misunderstanding, and it was 100,000 years wide, and it broke the galaxy. Corin Aumbre kept the file, sealed, in the drawer, beside the older box he could not read, for the rest of his life. He had done the one thing his whole life was for, he had read the whole truth and brought it into the light, and it had changed nothing, and he made his peace, at the end, with being the man who knew. He and Nadia Cole went on writing to each other, across the widening gap between what her people were about to face and what his could no longer pretend not to have proven, 2 witnesses who could not stop the thing they had both seen coming, and who gave each other, across that gap, the one mercy left available to either of them, which was to not be the only one who knew. Somewhere ahead, past his death, past the example, past the fall he could feel coming and could not stop, there was going to be another reckoner, in another age, who would find that older box in the archive, marked incomplete in a hand 10,000 years dead, and would stand where Aumbre stood, and feel the size of the thing that had been unwritten, and begin, at last, to pull the thread that Aumbre left hanging. That is another story, and it is not mine, and I have kept faith with this one by leaving its deepest box unopened, the same way its own archivist did. The Accord learned it could not measure humanity. It sealed the learning and chose the example. And the box stayed empty, all 9 of them, and the 10th hombre wrote himself, and the older one behind them all, empty in the only way that ever mattered, which is the way a thing is empty when it is really full, and no one left alive can read it. Nobody ever learned what was behind the oldest door. That is where the record runs out. The rest is the fall, and the fall is another season's grief, and this one ends here, with an old archivist and a sealed drawer and 10 empty boxes that were the fullest things anyone ever wrote, and the one word, in the oldest hand, that no one alive could read, incomplete.